I woke to the faint whisper of movement across my apartment, a sound so subtle it felt like my own heartbeat echoing against the walls. My eyes darted to the shadows pooling in the corners, and for a split second, I swore one of them shifted. Blinking, I thought I imagined it, just a trick of my tired eyes. But when my vision cleared, the shape in the corner had inched closer, a smear of darkness stretching impossibly along the floor. My throat tightened. I couldn't move, yet the air seemed to tremble around me. The lights flickered, briefly plunging the room into a hollow blackness. When the glow returned, the shadows seemed wrong. They weren't just stretched or slanted, they were bending toward me, like liquid waiting for me to breathe so they could flow into me. I tried to shake it off, laughing nervously, telling myself that old apartments make noises. But the corner of my eye caught movement again, something impossibly fast, like the darkness was alive, ducking behind the sofa, then reappearing just beyond reach, always just out of direct sight. And then I saw it clearly. When I blinked, it wasn't in the corner anymore. It had moved closer, a stretching, shifting presence that matched every blink I made. My pulse spiked. Something in my apartment was following my eyes, waiting for me to look away. Mornings were usually quiet, filled with the hum of the radiator and the distant rumble of traffic outside. I brewed coffee, the bitter steam filling the tiny kitchen, telling myself the shadows last night were nothing, just fatigue or too many late-night horror videos. I left for work, locking the door with a false sense of security. The hallway smelled of old carpet and damp paint, the same as always. Nothing here had ever moved before. I reminded myself that apartments have quirks, nothing more. At my desk, I focused on emails, the office buzzing around me. My mind kept replaying last night's flicker of shadows, but I shook it off. There was a logical explanation, light hitting the window differently, maybe a draft. My hands tightened around my mug. Lunch break brought a walk outside. The sunlight felt grounding, almost protective, as though the world outside was ordinary, untouchable by the creeping darkness in my apartment. I exhaled, hoping that when night came, nothing would greet me in the corners. Returning home, the hallway seemed familiar, safe even. The key turned in the lock without resistance. Nothing about the apartment had changed, or so I told myself. But I felt an itch in my chest, a tension I couldn't shake. I unpacked groceries, listening to the dull hum of the refrigerator. The shadows clung to the edges of the room, stretching along the walls. I blinked, heart lurching, and they stayed still. Relief washed over me. Maybe last night was a one-time thing. Evening television flickered across the wall. I tried to distract myself with a sitcom laugh track, but I noticed the shadows cast by the lamp were slightly off. Wrong angles, but subtle. I closed my eyes and counted slowly to 10, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. Dinner was simple. Pasta, a salad, nothing fancy. The apartment smelled faintly of tomato and garlic. I hummed quietly, trying to normalize the nightmarish sensation at the back of my mind, the sense that I was being observed by something that shouldn't exist. I watered the little plants by the window. One leaf had curled strangely, though I remembered leaving it perfectly flat this morning. A chill ran down my spine. I whispered to myself that it was coincidence, that I was tired, and my brain was overlaying horror on mundanity. By nightfall, the apartment settled into silence. I read a book on the couch, the lamp spilling soft light. The shadows lay inert, just shadows, nothing more. Yet I caught myself glancing repeatedly at the corners, flinching at shapes that seemed too dark to be normal. I checked the locks again. Everything was secure. My reflection in the darkened window stared back at me, wide-eyed, tense. I smiled faintly at my own paranoia. Perhaps I just needed rest. Tomorrow would be better, I thought. It always felt safer in the daylight. Finally, I crawled into bed, pulling the covers tight. The room was dark, quiet, almost welcoming. I told myself it was just shadows. My eyes shut, but even as sleep teased me, I felt the faintest tickle at the edge of sight, a movement in the corner of the room, gone when I blinked. That night, I woke to the sound of a floorboard creaking near the hallway. I froze, every muscle tensing. The apartment was supposed to be empty. I blinked, heart hammering, and the shadow near the door shifted, just slightly, as if it had been waiting for me to wake. I told myself it was nothing. Old wood, maybe the heater expanding. But then I noticed my blanket had been pulled slightly to one side. I hadn't moved. My stomach churned, and I swallowed hard, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. In the bathroom mirror, my reflection looked back, but the corner of my eye caught movement behind me. I spun empty air. My breath came in shallow bursts. When I blinked, I could have sworn the shadow lingered just beyond the doorframe, stretching unnaturally toward me. I returned to bed, trying to focus on the ceiling. My mind raced with impossible possibilities. Sleep was elusive, interrupted by tiny sounds, a scratch, a whisper, the faintest scraping across the floorboards. Every time I blinked, the shadows seemed to creep closer. By 3 a.m., I couldn't ignore it anymore. The lamp on the nightstand cast long shapes, and one of them didn't match the furniture. It quivered as I blinked, then flattened again. My pulse was deafening in my ears. I wanted to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. I grabbed my phone, the screen's glow illuminating the room. In that light, everything seemed normal. But when I looked up again, the shadow by the dresser had moved, closer than before, elongated, impossibly thin. I blinked. Gone. My chest ached with tension. I whispered to myself, "It's fine. It's just shadows." But the air had grown heavy, thick with an unspoken presence. The floor seemed colder under my bare feet. Every instinct screamed to run, yet I stayed frozen, unwilling to fully confront what was happening. The ticking of the wall clock became unbearable. I counted each tick, each blink, each shift of darkness. It was following a rhythm, synchronized with my own eyes. Panic coiled tight in my stomach as I realized I wasn't dreaming. Something alive was stalking me. I stood and edged toward the door, planning to escape to the hallway. My hand froze on the knob. The shadows in the corners weren't where they should be. They had changed positions while I blinked. My heart thudded violently. I could feel their gaze before I even turned my head. I backed away, retreating to the bed. The shadows pooled at the edge of the room like ink. I couldn't see a shape, but the sense of being watched, of being measured, was suffocating. I swallowed against the lump in my throat. The apartment had become something else entirely. A sudden crash from the kitchen made me jump, sending my phone skittering across the floor. My eyes tracked the darkness. It flickered and shifted like a living thing. I blinked, and the corner of the room was empty. Relief, fleeting, tightened my chest into sharp anxiety. I curled under the covers, trembling. Every blink now felt like a gamble. I couldn't look away, but I couldn't keep staring either. Something in my apartment had learned my pattern, and it was waiting, silent, patient, for the next moment I dared to close my eyes. Morning brought sunlight that felt almost healing. The shadows had retreated into corners, pretending to be ordinary. I shook off the terror, telling myself last night was an overactive imagination fueled by exhaustion. Maybe the shadows had moved on their own, like curtains in a draft. Coffee brewed, the aroma grounding me. I ran a hand over the walls, checked the furniture placement. Everything seemed exactly as it should, nothing out of place. I laughed nervously at my own fear, blaming the stress of work and sleepless nights. I left the apartment, avoiding glances at corners. Outside, life felt normal again. Dogs barking, cars honking, people walking past. No shadows followed here, no unnatural movements. My rational mind clung to that sense of security like a lifeline, desperate to convince me it was all in my head. At work, I immersed myself in tasks, but small moments kept unsettling me. A flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow that didn't match anything in the room. I forced myself to blink, shake my head, and return to emails, rationalizing that my eyes were playing tricks. Back home, I measured the apartment in daylight. The furniture hadn't moved. The shadows lay where they should. I walked around, deliberately closing my eyes for a moment, then opening them. Nothing happened. Relief blossomed. Maybe it had just been a dream. Dinner was quiet. I tried to enjoy it, telling myself I wasn't afraid. Yet, when I glanced at the hallway, the light seemed darker than it should be, corners deeper. I blinked, nothing. My pulse slowed, but the tension remained, lingering at the edges of awareness like an itch I couldn't scratch. I called a friend, laughing off last night's paranoia. I told them it was probably just the old apartment settling, old pipes, shadows from the streetlight outside. The words sounded hollow even to me. I didn't mention how the shadows seemed to move when I blinked. That would be insane. I tried watching television, focusing on the screen. Comedies, action shows, anything to distract myself. But each time I blinked, the shadows in the room seemed to twitch subtly, just enough for me to notice. I told myself it was imagination. I had to tell myself it had to be. I checked the locks, the windows, the door. Everything was secure. Still, a prickling at the back of my neck insisted something was wrong. I rationalized it as nerves, a leftover panic from last night, not a real threat. My rational mind and my gut were at war. Sleep returned reluctantly. I convinced myself to close my eyes slowly, counting to 10. Nothing happened. The shadows didn't move, the air stayed still. Relief surged through me, convincing me that maybe I had been overreacting all along. Maybe it really was nothing. I awoke again, feeling refreshed. The sunlight poured into the apartment, chasing away any lingering unease. The shadows were normal, mundane, safe. I told myself I had won. My mind, not the darkness, controlled reality. I even smiled at the thought. Maybe last night was the end. Yet as I prepared for the day, I noticed one corner of the room, a faint dark smear, elongated, almost liquid. I blinked. It wasn't there anymore. My stomach sank, and a tiny seed of doubt sprouted. Maybe my eyes weren't lying. Maybe the shadows weren't finished with me. It started subtly. At first, I only noticed the shadows twitching when I glanced away for a second. Blink, shift, blink, move. My eyes became instruments of terror, each closure a gamble I wasn't sure I could survive. I tried to map it in my head. The shadows weren't random. They had paths, angles, directions. They stretched toward me in predictable arcs whenever I wasn't looking directly at them. The thought made my skin crawl, but I couldn't stop watching. At work, I caught myself squinting at corners, imagining shapes moving where none should be. My coworkers laughed at my distraction, oblivious to the pattern I was beginning to fear. Every blink became a countdown, every glance a risk. Returning home one evening, I noticed the shadows lining the hallway like liquid tendrils. Blink. They recoiled slightly. Blink again. Closer. I froze, counting the rhythm. It was methodical, intentional, as if it understood my eyes, my reflexes, my fear. Dinner became impossible. I left the lights on, staring at walls, watching the shadows react. One corner in particular drew my focus. The darkness there quivered, stretched, then flattened again, following an invisible cycle. My heartbeat synced with the rhythm, a drum of mounting dread. I tried to film it, hoping to capture proof. My phone's camera didn't lie, or so I thought, but when I blinked to check the footage, the shadows had shifted again. It was as if reality itself bent around my eyes, refusing to be caught on screen. Sleep became fragmented. Each time I closed my eyes, the shadows followed. Not instantly, not as a blur, but in the microseconds between blink and sight, creeping closer, elongating, sometimes forming shapes that made my stomach churn. I avoided corners at all costs, but the shadows didn't respect boundaries. They pooled beneath tables, stretched along walls, curled near the ceiling. Blink. A wall-mounted shelf shadow stretched across the floor. Blink. It had receded. The apartment had turned into a trap of light and dark. I started leaving lights on in multiple rooms, pacing from one to another. Shadows adjusted, flowing, contorting, like water avoiding obstacles yet always reaching me. I blinked intentionally now, testing, counting, terrified of what would move while I closed my eyes. Even mundane objects seemed to join them. A chair shadow detached slightly from its legs. Blink. It hovered, flattened. Blink again. Normal. The air itself felt charged, heavy, as if the space inside my apartment was no longer just empty air, but something watching, learning. I began sleeping in short bursts, eyelids barely touching, afraid that a full sleep would let them cross the final boundary. My eyes ached, my body tired, but I couldn't risk blinking without consequence. They had become a predator synchronized with my own biology. I tried reasoning. Maybe it was hallucinations. Maybe it was stress, isolation, exhaustion. But my blinking confirmed otherwise. Shadows moved only when I blinked, every time, without fail. Consistency was no longer comfort. It was a chain binding me to fear. Mirrors became a hazard. I'd catch glimpses in reflection, blink, and the shadows would warp, stretch, shift. Sometimes they looked almost human, leaning slightly toward me. My stomach roiled, but I couldn't look away for long, afraid to trigger movement I could not control. The pattern was undeniable. Blink, move. Blink, shift. They were learning me, timing me, studying me. Every day, I lived in terror of my own eyes, a constant dance of sight and fear. My apartment had become a living entity, and I was both observer and prey. One night, I noticed it watching me differently. The shadows no longer merely moved, they reacted. I blinked, and a tendril curled toward where I sat. My stomach dropped. It wasn't just the apartment anymore. It was aware of me specifically. I spoke aloud, voice trembling. Why me? The room remained silent, yet the shadows stretched and recoiled as if answering. A wave of nausea and fear gripped me. I realized I had become the target, the one it wanted, the one it studied. My reflection in the window became unsettling. Blink. A dark figure seemed to linger behind my own reflection, mirroring my movements, but slightly delayed. I blinked again. Gone. The apartment's darkness was learning patience, learning anticipation, feeding off my unease. I avoided rooms whenever possible. The kitchen became a minefield. Every corner held potential movement. I couldn't cook without staring constantly, blinking sparingly, trembling with each microsecond my eyes closed. Fear had rewritten my daily routines. Voices whispered sometimes, not words, just tones, faint, almost melodic, echoing through the walls. Blink. Silence. Blink. A flicker of shape at the far corner. My pulse raced. I was being personalized, haunted with precision, as if the shadows knew my thoughts before I did. My hands shook constantly. The simplest actions, a sip of water, adjusting a book, became exercises in vigilance. I blinked rapidly, fearing what would creep closer while my eyelids closed. The apartment no longer felt like mine. It had become an extension of the predator. I tried talking to friends, describing the fear, the movement. Their laughter, their rational explanations, felt alien. They couldn't see it, couldn't understand the precision, the stalking rhythm. I realized isolation wasn't just physical, it was mental. I was alone in terror. Even the furniture betrayed me. A sofa cushion seemed to rise slightly between blinks, a chair's shadow elongated toward me, curling like a finger. Blink. Normal. Blink. Too close. I could feel its intent, the way it measured me. Anticipating the moment, I dared to close my eyes fully. Sleep became impossible. I rested only in micronaps, eyelids barely closing. Each blink was a calculated risk. Every room became a cage, each shadow a sentient warden. My body was exhausted, my mind raw, but the terror kept me awake, alert, a puppet of the darkness. I noticed small scratches on the floor that hadn't been there before. Blink. Gone. Blink. Reappeared closer to my bed. They weren't random. Someone, or something, was marking its territory, personalizing its space to torment me, to map me, to hunt me precisely. Sometimes I caught it in the mirror, eyes wide. Blink. It leaned closer, a formless figure, yet unmistakable in intent. Blink. Normal. I couldn't leave, couldn't fight, couldn't sleep without surrendering to its choreography. My existence was now defined by its attention. The pattern became terrifyingly intimate. Blink. Shift. Blink. Stretch. Every motion, every microsecond, tied to me. The apartment no longer had shadows. It had an entity whose sole purpose was to anticipate me, to respond to me, to study me as prey. Even my own body betrayed me. My twitches became panic triggers. Involuntary blinks sent pulses of terror racing through me. I had to control every reflex. My own biology had become a weapon in the hands of this lurking intelligence. By now, I barely moved without counting, planning, calculating. Even breathing felt dangerous. The shadows didn't just fill space. They stalked me personally, a presence synchronized to my every blink, every step, every exhalation. I had become prey in my own home. I stopped answering calls. Friends' voices, once comforting, became dangerous reminders of a world I couldn't touch. Each blink felt like a potential invitation for the shadows to reach me. Isolation was both a shield and a prison. I stopped leaving the apartment. Even the short walk to the corner store seemed impossible. Every outside shadow could mimic the apartment's movements. Every reflection, every fleeting silhouette could follow me home. The outside world had become an extension of the hunt. Food delivery became my lifeline. I left doors cracked, staring at them while blinking cautiously. Each trip from the elevator to my apartment was a gauntlet of fear. The corridor walls seemed alive, stretching and recoiling in rhythm with my cautious eyes. I stopped looking out the window. The outside world no longer offered comfort. It mirrored the apartment's unpredictability. Shadows along the fire escape appeared too thick, too purposeful. Blink. Shift. Blink. A figure almost, but impossible to define, waiting for me even in daylight. Even my own reflection became unbearable. Mirrors, screens, anything glassy, a threat. Blink. The darkness in reflection lingered slightly too long, stretched unnaturally. Blink. Normal. Each blink a reminder that I wasn't alone, that every surface, every angle, could be a stalking point. I abandoned my phone camera. It no longer captured proof, only frustration. Blink. Shadows moved despite the lens. Blink. Gone. I was trapped in a space where evidence didn't exist, and reality had become a cruel illusion I could never fully trust. The apartment felt alive. The floorboards moaned in patterns. Blink. The corners seemed to lean toward me. Blink. The ceiling darkened unnaturally, curling at edges I couldn't directly see. I had stopped naming these things as shadows. They were entities now, conscious, patient, waiting. The walls themselves seemed to whisper. Sometimes, I could almost hear shapes moving across them, stretching while I wasn't looking. Blink. Silence. Blink. A ripple in the darkness, just enough to trigger a shiver that traveled straight to my spine. I began speaking to the shadows, quietly, almost desperately. "Leave me alone," I whispered. They didn't answer, but the air shifted. Blink. They recoiled slightly. Blink. They advanced. I realized communication had no effect. Fear alone drove them. My presence fed their rhythm. I stopped moving quickly. Every action was deliberate, calculated. I blinked with care, sometimes forcing long stares to control their shifts. My world had narrowed to inches, rooms, corners, each step measured against the possibility of triggering a movement I could not survive. Even my breathing became an act of control. I measured it, slowed it, timed it with my blinks, hoping to avoid provoking attention. But I was too late. Even microseconds of relaxation invited ripples of dark motion I could feel more than see. I realized I had no allies, no safety, no escape. The apartment, once mine, had become a trap, and I the prey. Isolation wasn't punishment, it was inevitability. I blinked, and the shadows leaned closer, patient, intimate, merciless. One night, I blinked, and the darkness didn't recoil. It stayed, thick and heavy, pressing into the corners of the room like a living weight. My chest tightened, and I realized it had learned the rhythm. It no longer needed me to blink to move. I focused on my reflection in the window. Blink. The shadow behind me didn't stretch or shift. It stared. Not a formless smear, not an abstract tendril, but a shape resembling me, twisted, watching, anticipating. My own reflection had been replaced by it. A whisper slithered through the air, unmistakably human. "Why do you blink?" it hissed. My blood ran cold. I had thought it was just shadows, a predator in darkness. But it spoke. It knew me, my habits, my instincts, and it mocked them. I tried to run, but the hallway bent unnaturally. Blink. The space stretched and contorted, walls and doors shifting to funnel me back into the living room. Panic tore through me. The apartment itself wasn't just haunted, it had become a mechanism to trap me. The figure moved toward me deliberately, step by step, synchronized with my every involuntary blink. I realized then, this wasn't random haunting. It wasn't playful or cruel. It was a predator studying its prey, learning its weaknesses, feeding off its fear, and I had become the pattern. I looked down and realized the shadows were forming shapes of my past, faces of people I knew, twisted, melting into darkness. Blink. They whispered memories, regrets, fears. Blink. They receded, replaced by new forms, new horrors. They weren't just shadows. They were me, my life, and my terror made flesh. And then, I understood the final truth. The entity didn't just move when I blinked. It existed because I blinked. Every eyelid closure gave it form, gave it life, gave it power. I was its creator, and my body had become its endless ritual. I stopped sleeping completely. Every blink became a calculated risk, each microsecond of darkness a potential birth for something I couldn't fight. I no longer rested. I existed in constant vigilance, a prisoner of my own reflexes. The apartment felt alive in ways I couldn't comprehend. Doors hummed faintly. Floors creaked deliberately. Shadows pooled and retracted like tides. Following a rhythm only I seemed capable of triggering. I was no longer the observer. I was the instrument. I tried leaving once, stepping into the hallway with the front door open. Blink. The corridor twisted unnaturally. Blink. Shadows stretched from the walls, elongating toward me, as though the building itself were alive and waiting for my return. I bolted back inside. Food delivery became a ritual of terror. I left doors cracked, standing near enough to watch shadows react as I retrieved bags. Blink. Shapes shifted in greeting. Blink. They advanced. I understood now. Any break in attention meant risk. The apartment had made me its sentinel. Mirrors became dangerous traps. Even the faintest reflection could give it form. Blink. My own face morphed into something unknown, watching me, mirroring terror I hadn't imagined. Blink. Normal. Blink. The shadows pulsed with anticipation, hungry for the next movement I would unwittingly give. I tried to document it. Cameras, phones, even old photographs. Nothing recorded it. Blink. Shapes moved anyway. Blink. They lingered only for me. Blink. The entity had become my private horror, visible only to the eyes that summoned it. I was alone in witnessing it. I stopped calling for help. There was no help. Blink. I felt it studying me. Blink. It knew me better than I knew myself. Blink. I understood that no one else could intervene, no one else could see. I had made it, and it belonged solely to me. Sometimes I catch glimpses of it in fleeting reflections, my own form twisted, the shadows slithering along the edges. Blink. It waves, almost mockingly. Blink. It advances. Blink. I flinch. There is no escape, no safety, no peace. Only vigilance, only fear. I fear sleep. I fear my own eyes. Blink. I sense it in the corners. Blink. It reacts. Blink. It waits. I am both the creator and the prey, trapped in an endless cycle where each blink births a shadowed reflection of my worst nightmares. Even now, writing this, I keep my eyes open as long as I can. Blink. I see movement in the corner. Blink. It leans closer. Blink. It waits. Every eyelid closure feeds it, gives it life, and I cannot stop blinking. I will never stop blinking.